Greetings, students. Welcome to an exciting day where we're going to talk about the roots of what we see now as contemporary neo-paganism. And we see that a lot of it coalesced starting in the 1850s with changes in the way people were thinking about magic than they ever had before. And we're going to look at several groups and several thinkers today that were undeniably the sort of forefathers of what we see in modern Wicca, neo-paganism, Thelema, ceremonial magic of any kinds, all of that stuff that's developed now and that is all out and in the air is really, I think, rooted in this period that we're going to talk about today. So, first off, who's this Ronald Hutton character and his fantastic book, Triumph of the Moon, which I recommend you buy and read cover to cover if you want. You read a couple of chapters from it today. Hutton is a scholar of British history, and he's a foremost authority on contemporary neo-paganism. Now, he draws widely from many disciplines in order to kind of unpack what is going on in the contemporary world with neo-paganism. So sometimes that will be looking at histories of witchcraft accusations or practices that are considered something like witchcraft, sort of like what we saw with the cunning folk in our reading today. He's got a big argument, and that's that he wants to challenge ahistorical claims for all religious groups. He tries to historicize everything, put history on everything. And he's particularly perturbed by, and I agree with him, this notion that there is a Wicca or a witchcraft or even a neo-shamanism that is eternal, that has been going on since time eternal, and is a continuation of this tradition. Because what's going on in modern neo-paganism is a syncretic, namely puts a lot of stuff together, new religious movement that's gotten pretty big. But despite the claims of neo-pagans that they are following a tradition or a craft, when they say the craft, which is not Freemasonry, which we'll talk about in a second, when they say that they're doing that thing that has been done by their forefathers and foremothers since the dawn of time, there's no evidence of that. It's a new thing. It's a very new thing that has been crafted from some prior elements. But as a whole, it's a new religious movement. And contemporary neo-paganism really only gets going like the 1960s. So despite your pagan friend who says, oh, we are practicing the traditions of our foremothers since the dawn of time, and we suffered under the burning times during the witchcraft accusations and the witch burnings and whatnot. It's just not true. So why do people make these arguments? Because people make ahistorical arguments and claim that their religion or anything that they're doing is from since the dawn of time, not to really make a historical claim. It really doesn't matter if that's true or not. What it matters is that the claim gives people a sense of authority. I think often about how when I was raised Protestant, I would go to church and I would hear people always saying, oh, what we're doing here in our church is what was close to what the early Christians were doing in the time just after Christ. Forget that whole Catholicism thing. They were all right. You know, Catholicism is old. Protestant Christianity as we see it now, arguably the 20th century, but you have the Great Awakening in the 1800s and sort of the rise of Protestantism in America. But that Protestantism looks a little different now than it did then. So I always thought, how do we know this? And they would say, oh, yeah, they do. But the question was, the question and the answer was not, in fact, were they doing something that the early Christian church was doing? It was, can we argue that we are? Because that gives us a greater sense of authority over Catholics. And if you look into the early Christian church, they were doing things like funeral feasts, baptizing the dead. They were doing all sorts of really interesting rituals. There was a lot of magic involved. So early Christianity does not look like what they're doing down the block at the First Baptist Church or the Calvinist church that I was a part of. Anyway, so what Hutton does is he tries to figure out the history, where the actual history of influences are. You can call this a genealogy of history. You look at what inspired what, is connected to what, to work out almost like a family genealogy. Okay, so He also wrote a fair bit about Druids and Arthurian legends. And I haven't read those books, and I'd like to. Anyway, Triumph of the Moon is the definitive study of the foundation of Wicca and neo-paganism in Britain. When I say Wicca, I mean witchcraft. The word Wicca comes from Gerald Gardner, and he actually traces it back further. I think there are some Latin and Greek cognates with Wicca to get witchcraft. Anyway, so Gardner was the founder of the main first Wicca group in Britain. Some critics say that Hutton does not sufficiently address non-Gardnerian Wicca, non-sort of orthodox Wicca, whatever you will. So he also wrote some extensive histories of witches, witchcraft accusations, and folklore and folk practices. And one overwhelming theme in his work is to study secrecy and to study secret society. He argues that neo-paganism may have some resonances with pre-modern religions, especially notions of the craft and cunning folk and charming, but neo-paganism is thoroughly modern. There is, in fact, no evidence of a grand matriarchy stretching back into antiquity. You'll often hear this argument in pagan groups. It's like, oh, well, we venerate women and matriarchy just like once upon a time all the world was ruled by women. We don't have evidence of there being an ancient matriarchy. Okay, so Triumph of the Moon is interesting. He writes in the preface, the subtitle of this book should really be A History of Modern Pagan Witchcraft in South Britain, including England, Wales, Cornwall, and the Isle of Man, with some reference to it in the rest of the British Isles, continental Europe, and North America. The fact that this book claims to be a history and not the history is in itself significant, for this book represents the first systematic attempt by a professional historian to characterize and account for this aspect of modern Western culture. So it's a history. It is not the history. If you look at the book, it says The Triumph of the Moon, A History of Modern Pagan Witchcraft. So it's not definitive. It's always interpreting. And I love this image over here of this cat with a pentagram, the moon, and the stars and whatnot. This just looks like I cracked open some of my pagan friends' heads and this image came out. Now, Hutton's interesting. He states that his own religious views are private. He says that I'm not going to tell you them. That's my own private business. He was, in fact, raised in a neo-pagan family. At his age, that's somewhat, it's not unique, but I mean, there weren't a lot of people that were raised in a neo-pagan family. And he knew Wiccans, in fact, friends of his family from a very young age. Now, his work is, for the most part, accepted by the pagan community, except for those who stick to this perennialist argument that Wicca is an unbroken ancient religion that now flourishes today. Now, what do I mean when I say perennialism? Perennialism says that there is an eternal truth that stretches either through religions to a primordial past, or that all other religions are reduced to having the same insights as sort of like a contemporary religion. So perennialism, it's bullshit. Okay. There is no such thing as an ancient religion that completely stretches throughout time. All claims of such are about claiming authority for something, or reducing complex, diverse religious cultures into universal claims to be connected to specific claims. Now, he tends to be accepted in most neo-pagan circles, and he's very comfortable in them. He speaks at neo-pagan events all the time. I suspect that he's actually a little bit more pagan than he admits, but I'm a little bit more Hindu than I would admit, I think. So he notes that historians are not as objective as they claim to be, that in fact, as scholars and historians, we are effected or affected, and we effect or maybe even affect what we study when we write. All right, take a break. I'll come right back.